Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA, Episode 55 for the week ending June 2, 2017, the Covfefe edition. This week, Jay and I have a wide-ranging discussion on some of the week's top compliance and ethics stories really across the globe. We take a look at the Brazilian meatpacker JBS, who agreed to the largest fine ever for bribery and corruption, $3.2 billion in Brazil. We consider the sentencing of Sam Mebiame, who's sentenced to 2 years in jail for paying bribes to help Och-Ziff with lucrative mining deals in Africa. In addition to his sentence, the judge had some pretty choice words about why no one else was prosecuted and corporations receiving PPAs. Very interesting. We take a look at the very unusual situation in the United Kingdom where a merger of two candidates, AMEC and the Wood Group, in that merger, both the acquirer and the target turned out to be under SFO investigations for their use of Unaoil as an agent. We explore what are the implications of that case literally across the globe. We talk about compliance making its way up into the board of directors level. We review Matthew Stephenson's very provocative piece asking, did Jared Kushner violate the FCPA in any of his negotiations with Russian bankers for funding of his properties in Manhattan? Jay gives us a sneak peek at his weekend report. We consider the Golden State Warriors win and the Astros still leading the major leagues. And I, once again, ask people to buy my book. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening to This Week in FCPA. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA, Episode 55 for the week ending June 2, 2017, the Covfefe edition. This week, Jay and I are going to wrap up the compliance and ethics-related stories from the week. We've got some really interesting things, literally global in nature, Jay. So I thought we might start with the Brazilian meatpacker. JBS has agreed to the largest anti-corruption fine or fine for bribery and corruption ever, $3.2 billion in Brazil. So really interesting case out of there. What were your thoughts on that matter?
Well, one thing that I want to see when the dust settles is that was it either 2 days after or 2 days before they reached settlement that their Brazilian counsel, Trench Rossi, disassociated themselves with the company. And I believe JBF still retains Baker McKenzie as U.S. counsel, but I'd like to know what were the circumstances that led to that breakup.
That is quite interesting. One thing we should note is that the fine and penalty is the largest ever. I think they have 30 years to pay it, so it's quite a good payout for the company. Nevertheless, I think it really brings up a couple of different angles that we should explore, Jay. Certainly from the global anti-corruption enforcement, when you have the biggest settlement ever, that makes news. But it also points to really the endemic corruption that had been going on in Brazil, and more importantly now, the investigation and enforcement against that corruption. So we've got Brazilian prosecutors who are going after literally the biggest corporations in the country, in addition to the politicians, around bribery and corruption. So continued leadership from the Brazilian prosecutors in this area. For those who do not think that the U.S. has an interest in facilitating anti-corruption enforcement outside the United States, whether that's under the FCPA or facilitating enforcement or investigations for other countries, I think this case clearly answers that. JBS actually imported meat and poultry products to the United States, and many of those products that came to the United States were from the company that paid bribes to health inspectors, veterinarians, other Brazilian government officials to take a blind eye and look the other way. Now, I'm not saying that rancid meat and poultry got to the United States, but it's sure a lot more possible when you do not have the appropriate government level of meat and poultry inspection Also, JBS is one of the has a U.S. affiliate, so we don't know the implications of that. We don't know whether that U.S. affiliate was part of the bribery and corruption scheme. Certainly, a U.S. affiliate is going to make the company subject to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And with Baker and McKenzie involved, I would certainly expect that there's cooperation going on between the company and U.S. prosecutors over this issue. So, not that we've just scratched the surface, but I think there's a lot more there that will be unpacked. And certainly, Trench Rossi, a very prestigious, well-known firm in Brazil, and indeed the Brazilian affiliate of Baker and McKenzie, disassociating with themselves is a very, very interesting development. You rarely see that unless something became very crosswise between the client and the law firm. So we'll have to continue to keep our eye on that one, Jay. The second one was in, I'm not sure if it's going to be the end of Och-Ziff or a follow-up to the Och-Ziff case. The fixer or third party hired by Och-Ziff to pay bribes in Africa to secure lucrative mining deals, Samuel Mebiame, if I've pronounced that right, was sentenced to 2 years in jail. And he pled guilty, so there's no question of his guilt. But what I found interesting, Jay, was number one, the government asked for a 5-year sentence. He asked for 10 months in jail, which he had previously or was currently serving. So basically, he would get to walk. And the judge gave 2 years. And the judge's reasoning was that no one else had been prosecuted in this case. No other individuals had been criminally prosecuted. And the judge publicly scolded the Department of Justice in asking why there were no other criminal prosecutions. The AUSA present at the hearing said that the government was working on it. But I think the judge was dead spot on. And he criticized the use of DPAs, where companies could come in and get a deferred prosecution agreement. And here, the individual who actually cooperated with the government is sentenced to 2 years in jail. So a rather unusual public outburst by a judge on the lack of robust enforcement by the Department of Justice. We don't know how this might play out, if at all, going forward. I don't know if this will play into the ongoing debate about whether or not DPA should be a part of FCPA enforcement or not. But when you have a federal judge excoriating the government for prosecuting the individuals but not the company, or higher up individuals in the company, it's certainly unusual, Jay.
I think the judge channeled his inner Howard Beale.
I think that was it, huh?
I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore. Everybody get out there and talk to those white shoe law firms who march into your courts and say, I'm sick of getting DPAs. We have a law, so someone, maybe the DOJ, should go out and enforce it.
Well, that's very interesting when we have an attorney general who says somebody broke the law, we're going to enforce it. And whether that changes the calculus on FCPA enforcement or not, it's still an open question. If the department does aggressively change its posture or changes its posture to a more aggressive approach towards criminally prosecuting either corporations or high-ranking individuals, it could have serious consequences, particularly along the lines of companies willing to self-disclose and report. It's one thing to self-disclose and self-disclose, cooperate, and remediate to try to drive your overall fine and penalty down. It's quite another thing to self-disclose, cooperate, remediate, and then find out you're going to jail anyway. So just a very odd and really interesting development in that situation. Why anyone would be surprised Och-Ziff got a DPA, though, is pretty clear to me why they got it. They had very good lawyers. And if we learn one thing from O.J. Simpson that we perfected here in Texas, if you got the money to hire very good lawyers, you're going to get a good result most of the time. So anyway, but we'll have to watch that one, Jay. That one could really have some additional fallout that could percolate down to the level of the compliance officer going forward. Let's go across the pond to a really interesting situation that's come up, Jay, in the proposed merger of AMEC, it's a UK construction company, and the Wood Group. This is a friendly merger. It's not an unfriendly takeover. But it turns out that both the acquirer, AMEC, and the target, Wood Group, are under investigation from the Serious Fraud Office relating to their use of Unaoil as an agent. And so that really brings up some interesting questions, I think, Jay, that your clients and my clients would have, which is, what do we do? What do we do when the entity that's buying us discloses to us, or we uncover that they're under a anti-corruption violation investigation? What do you do when your target turns out is under investigation by the relevant government authorities? How many government authorities across the world may be investigating both of these companies? Because I know Wood Group, for instance, has a very significant presence here in Texas and in the United States generally. So we have to assume that information about Unaoil has been shared with the U.S. Department of Justice. We have some pretty established rules under the FCPA around post-acquisition integration of a target into your compliance program, which requires integration of your compliance program, training of senior executives and high-risk individuals, pretty aggressive time frame training, forensic audits of the target's books and records to see if there's any outstanding violations hidden in the books that weren't popped up in pre-acquisition due diligence, and then turning that information over to the government. We also have a fairly robust system of pre-acquisition due diligence that the Department of Justice has talked to us about, at least since the 2012 FCPA guidance, and going forward on the types of due diligence you should do in pre-acquisition. We had an opinion release on that subject, and recognizing that you never get to do all the pre-acquisition due diligence you want, and you may be limited by a particular nuances of some countries' laws. Nevertheless, I think in the United States, you and I could probably formulate an answer to that if our client came to us. But in the United Kingdom, the M&A part is really not fleshed out in any of the commentary to the UK Bribery Act. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how these two parties might resolve this. We recorded our panel podcast, Everything Compliance, a little bit earlier today, and with our colleague Jonathan Armstrong, we posed the same question, and he had what I thought was a really creatively interesting response, which was that perhaps, and emphasize the word perhaps, the parties, meaning the Wood Group and AMEC, could work with the Serious Fraud Office to craft some DPA, which would resolve the open issues. And of course, in the United Kingdom, the DPA is under the court's jurisdiction, so there would be court involvement. Jonathan recognized this has not been done in this situation, and it's lots of moving parts in the speedy operation of acquisition and takeover. But kudos for some creative thinking there. And if that occurs, because of the public nature of deferred prosecution agreements in the United Kingdom, that court documents would be released. And so we would have some guidance from the court on what they thought were the key elements of dealing with this fact scenario. So I spit out a lot there, Jay, but certainly you've worked with companies. You've been in companies in M&A. You've been the target, and you've also been the acquirer. Really, how would you think through advising a client when you got this type of information on either side of the fence?
Well, generally what tends to happen is if you thought you were going into a clean transaction and then you saw that if one or both of the parties had some issues, the first thing you would have to think about, number one, is the viability of that company going forward. Then a quick number two would be taking a look at the purchase price. And what happens quite often is that this is the opportunity for the acquirer to leverage the information about the potential violations and really negotiate a rock bottom price. We've seen a couple examples where also the remediation might be priced into the deal, whereas you would pay a lower purchase price for the asset, but that money that you're not paying would be used to move forward and start immediate remediation and start working on a combined compliance for the joined entity. I think what's really interesting about this is that both companies have been dinged by Unaoil. So it's probably interesting in the first place that they wanted to merge. And, number two, to your point about the SFO, using a DPA, but using it under court order, it could definitely reveal some very interesting information about these two companies.
So I think you're spot on in talking about the business side of it, and really will it devalue either side? Certainly, if your target turns out to be under some sort of governmental investigation, that could negatively impact the purchase price. But here we have the anomaly of both the acquirer and the target. So you have a double valuation question. But that's really an area that I don't think gets enough play in the FCPA commentariat, which is the devolution or devaluation, perhaps more properly, of the acquired company. I represented a company once that purchased a Canadian company. Turned out 25% of that Canadian company was tied up in a JV in Russia. And I was part of the team that looked very closely at the Canadian company, but that's all we looked at. And we didn't look at that JV. And the JV just could not be remediated, and the company, the acquiring entity, ended up just giving the JV to the Russian owners because they couldn't fix it. So it certainly devalued that. We've had Elandia and Latinode, the enforcement action, famous or infamous, where Elandia had to write off their entire, or rather the entire investment had to be written off. So taking a look at it, and even if you don't have to write off the entire investment, if part of your purchase price is based upon contracts which were illegally obtained, or say they were legally obtained because the country in question was not subject to the FCPA, or the company in question was not subject to the FCPA, and bribery was not illegal in the country where it occurred. Once that target becomes acquired and it's you, and you're subject to the FCPA, you cannot continue those contracts because they were obtained illegally. And so you're going to lose that revenue. And if that's a significant revenue stream anticipated, that certainly could negatively impact. So lots of issues in that case, lots of issues that I don't think get enough contemplation, and certainly the negative business aspect, and we hadn't even touched on the reputational issues, but just on the business aspect. So very interesting as well. Judge,
so what would we call this now? It's not successor liability, but is it co-confessor liability?
Well, for those that engage in the confessional, perhaps so.
Okay.
I don't think either one of us are fall into that category, though.
Covfefe.
So I was interested that our colleague over at the Wall Street Journal, Risk and Corruption Journal, at the Wall Street Journal, Ben DiPietro, Mets fan extraordinaire, wrote a piece about compliance making its way to the board of directors. And although this is not something you and I have, I think, directly hit on before, we've certainly touched around it. Many of the corporate scandals we've seen over the past couple of years, obviously Wells Fargo, VW, Theranos, are situations where the board of directors really had no clue about compliance, ethics, risk management. I was struck this week, Jay, when I read that former Reagan Secretary of State George Shultz, who was on the Theranos board, he was deposed in litigation underlying that company. And when asked, what questions did you put to Theranos majority stockholder Elizabeth Holmes after there was public notification of alleged fraud in the proprietary testing, he said none. Didn't ask her a thing. Didn't know what to ask. Assumed everything was fine. And that really drove home to me, Jay, the boards need to kind of take up their game. But Ben wrote an article where talked about compliance is actually making its way to the board. And I think this can only benefit the compliance profession and certainly the chief compliance officer. But putting board compliance expertise at the board is, I think, going to be an increasingly important part of boards going forward. So kind of what do you see in the top to bottom ethical culture issues here?
Well, for the longest time, everyone's been talking about a seat at the table. So it appears that that's happening. And we've kind of navigated through the, what is the best reporting structure? Do they need to go through the GC or go directly to the CEO? I think the other part that's interesting in Ben's article is that this research that he's quoting was done by both Ethisphere and Conversant. And one of the things that I know you really are looking towards the future with the Internet of Things and different data feeds is how we can start to use technology to, strategically embed ethics and compliance in the day-to-day business. So I know you go to a lot of different conferences like I do, and in terms of gauging how far we are there in terms of technology, where would you guess we are, and how long would you think it's going to be before we get something like an electronic silver bullet here?
Well, I don't think there's ever going to be an electronic silver bullet, Jay. I think it's always going to be a combination of human and technological resources. I think what we've got to get is greater board engagement and greater board expertise. George Shultz may be the poster child for, having a prestigious board member, but when you have a board member who doesn't even ask questions after alleged illegal conduct has arisen, that's not serving the board, and it's not serving the stakeholders. It's not serving the shareholders. It's a board not engaging in their legal duty. So I think we're not going to see really a magic bullet, but we're going to see more engagement, more data being provided to the CCO, and in turn that data with appropriate analysis being provided by the board. But the board's got to ask some questions. They can't just take these reports and say, thank you very much. The board's going to have to spend some time because the issue of risk is just too great. This piddly little scandal is going to cost Wells Fargo billions. And Theranos, it may still exist going forward, but it may not. And that when you have that kind of catastrophic risk and you have a board that doesn't even consider it, that's really a disconnect.
Totally agree.
So someone from your former neck of the woods, our colleague Matthew Stephenson, founder and editor of the Global Anti-Corruption blog, continued his provocativeness around the Trump administration by writing a piece entitled, Did Jared Kushner Violate the FCPA? Or at least that was the issue. The title was even more provocative. Jared Kushner may have violated the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And I've done some additional research on this beyond Professor Stephenson's article. And pretty clearly there was a meeting between Kushner and Sergei Kiselak and Sergei Gorkov, the head of the Russian state-owned head of a Russian state-owned bank. The government, as in the U.S. government, is looking into this for security breaches or other violations. But Professor Stephenson wrote about it from the angle of the FCPA because we have Jared Kushner, the son-in-law of the president, allegedly trying to obtain funding from a Russian bank to help on a refinancing for his family-owned business or building in Manhattan. And query, did he promise anything for that? all of this occurred before he came into government, between the time of the election. But certainly, if this was a straight FCPA analysis, I think it would be enough there to at least consider it. So kudos to Professor Stephenson for raising this from the FCPA perspective. And I thought, it's they seem to have a lot of open issues running through the White House and their staff right now.
I totally agree. And, I've been accused of being a little bit too political before, so I don't want to comment anymore. But all I do want to say is I can't wait till we talk next week and see what we hear on June 8th. I think that will be pretty interesting.
Yeah, I had a fellow ask me today if I was available for a con call next week, and I said every day but the 8th. So I think it's going to be must-see TV. Well, Jay, I was going to ask you to kind of preview your weekend report, and if I could set it up a little bit. When we recorded our Everything Compliance podcast, you really had an interesting angle to compliance that I don't think is talked about enough. And I wrote down what you said because it struck me so much, which is compliance as a competitive advantage. Now, for an agent or other third party who either has a compliance program or received FCPA training, I think that could be an advantage. But you talked about it in a much broader scope, which is if a company has a compliance program and a best practices compliance program, why that can give them a competitive advantage. And I really wanted to see if on today our podcast, if you might be able to just kind of explain how you would see that going forward.
Sure. Then thanks for the intro and the inspiration. When we were speaking earlier this morning on the Everything Compliance podcast, that's going to come out over the weekend. One of the things I was looking at is my involvement within FCPA comes from a couple different backgrounds, initially from the translation business and now coming in from the corporate independent monitoring business. And one of the things that I've noticed in both situations when working with clients is you have certain organizations that are really take to heart the message of sharing information and working together. And in the podcast, we just spoke about examples on how, there were certain companies that I worked with that if I helped them translate their code of conduct, it could take a month to do the translations, and it could take 6 months to get sign off through the organization because it was so siloed. And I just shared some best practices about companies who really take a look at the subject matter experts who are throughout the organization, and there's no need to do 4 audits or 4 reports when internal audit has that capability to do it. And it's really just about sharing the information and finding out who is the best person getting their buy-in and then working together. And ultimately, if you have a situation like that, you can have, having a going forward plan where not only do you have state-of-the-art compliance, but you have compliance, which also can be a competitive advantage.
So I thought that was a really good point, and I think I hope that we can continue to explore this, continually to talk about it, and really get this message into the greater compliance community. Because one of the things that really struck me about your concept, and as you articulated, Jay, is it really puts compliance as a revenue generator. And we typically don't think of compliance as a revenue generator. Compliance may be seen as improving business process, leading to greater efficiencies, that sort of thing. But as a true revenue generator, and if we can start having that sort of discussion that really takes the all of the negatives you hear about, well, what's the ROI? Why should I pay for this? What's it going to give me? Well, this is exactly what it will give you, a competitive advantage that shows how compliance is really generating revenue for your company. And that will really take, I think, really lead to an expansion of the compliance profession going forward. We got to talk about my book. The new book is still out, 2016, The Year in Corporate FCPA Enforcement, still available at complianceweek.com. I hope you will check it out. I've got a link in the show notes to how you would purchase it. Have to say, of course, for you Californians listening, the Warriors won big last night, just as I predicted. So I'm going to see if we get a faux. Odds, I don't think. I think the pundits would say no, but they were pretty outstanding last night, Jay.
I will go along with you and say faux.
And say faux. And of course,
faux and Covfefe, right?
And Covfefe and the Astros still have the best record in baseball. So how about all that?
But try as you may, keep trying to jinx them every week, and you might get lucky.
Fair enough. Well, Jay, it's been a great roundup. You want to take us home?
Sure. On behalf of Tom Fox, the compliance evangelist, and myself, Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitor, we thank you for joining us as we take a look at the FCPA week that was for the week ending June 2nd, 2017. Thanks for listening, and have a great weekend, everyone.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of This Week in FCPA. If you have listened to this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate us, as it would help in our rankings and help get the word out about the only weekly compliance-related podcast. Also, Jay and I would love to hear from you. You can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. You can email Jay at jrosen@affiliatedmonitors.com. This is Tom Fox. Thank you again for listening, and I hope you'll join us again for another episode of This Week at FCPA.